The sun dipped low over Dallas Love Field Airport, spilling amber and gold across the tarmac like liquid fire. Business travelers shuffled through the bustling terminal, some clutching phones to their ears, others dragging rolling bags that clattered noisily over the tiles. Among them stood Peter Hensley, a man whose life was a monument to calculated success. Tall, impeccably dressed in a navy suit, his sharp crease of trousers mirrored the precision he demanded from himself and everyone around him. Peter glanced at his first-class ticket, a faint smirk playing on his lips. First class wasn't just convenience for him, it was more than that, it was a declaration. A statement of where he belonged in this world. With purposeful strides, he moved toward gate 14, his expensive leather shoes tapping out a rhythm against the polished floor. Another flight, another routine step in his relentless pursuit of more. As the flight attendants called for first-class boarding, Peter stepped forward, exuding an air thick with entitlement. His sharp eyes darted to the other passengers joining the line, assessing them quickly, judging their worth or lack thereof. One man caught his attention, a few steps behind him, about Peter's height but broader, radiating a calm confidence that felt almost out of place. The stranger wore a plain black hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, an outfit so simple it jarred against Peter's expectations. Must have won a ticket in a raffle, Peter muttered under his breath, smirking to himself as if the thought alone confirmed his superiority. He boarded the plane, finding his window seat with satisfaction. Leaning back, he let the luxury of first class envelop him, watching as others filed in. To his surprise, and growing irritation, the casually dressed man stopped beside him, glancing at the seat number before stowing his carry-on above. Peter stiffened as the man settled into the aisle seat next to him. For a moment, neither spoke. Peter's jaw clenched as he fought the urge to say something cutting. Instead, he pulled out his tablet, pretending to focus on emails while stealing sidelong glances at his seatmate. The man seemed utterly unfazed, adjusting his seatbelt and pulling out a book. Peter squinted at the title. It wasn't a bestseller he recognized, nor did it look like light reading. Of course, Peter thought bitterly, rolling his eyes inwardly. Trying to look intellectual. The flight attendants began moving down the aisle, offering pre-departure drinks. When they reached Peter's row, the attendant addressed the man first. "Good evening, Mr. Greer," she said warmly, her smile genuine. "Can I get you anything to drink before takeoff?" Peter blinked, startled by the familiarity in her tone. Mr. Greer declined politely, thanking her with an effortless smile that somehow made Peter feel smaller. Glancing at the name embroidered on the cover of the man's book, Peter's mind churned. A Greer. Surely, it meant nothing significant. But there was something about the man's presence, something unsettling, that gnawed at Peter's confidence. He didn't know it yet, but this flight would be anything but ordinary. Before the wheels even left the ground, Peter's assumptions would lead him into uncharted territory, forcing him to confront truths he never expected. As the plane began taxiing toward the runway, Peter's irritation simmered beneath the surface. The man beside him, this Greer, seemed completely unbothered, reading with quiet focus, occasionally pausing to jot notes in the margins. Meanwhile, Peter's tablet screen glowed brighter, emails piling up like bricks in a wall of self-importance. The silence between them stretched taut, at least from Peter's perspective. Clearing his throat loudly, he hoped to draw attention, but Mr. Greer didn't so much as glance up. Annoyed, Peter decided to break the ice, though his words carried the sharp edge of condescension. "Looks like you got lucky with this seat," Peter said, his voice dripping with artificial politeness. Mr. Greer looked up, offering a polite but neutral smile. "Excuse me?" "I mean, first class isn't usually this casual," Peter continued, gesturing subtly toward the man's hoodie. "But hey, I suppose everyone deserves to treat themselves once in a while." The comment hung heavy in the air, laden with implication. Passengers across the aisle glanced over, their expressions a mix of discomfort and curiosity. Slowly, deliberately, Mr. Greer closed his book. "That's one way to look at it," he replied evenly, his tone calm but weighted, as if deciding whether this conversation was worth pursuing. Peter, emboldened by what he perceived as a lack of resistance, chuckled. "Don't get me wrong, I'm all for people experiencing a little luxury. It's just, not everyone's used to it, you know? Makes things feel different." He gave a knowing smile, as if sharing a secret with someone who couldn't possibly understand. The response came quietly but unexpectedly. "Different isn't always a bad thing." Peter leaned back slightly, taken aback. But before he could reply, the flight attendant returned with drinks for the row. She handed Peter his sparkling water before turning to Mr. Greer. "Mr. Greer, are you sure I can't get you anything? It's no trouble at all." Her tone was deferential, almost reverent. Peter's brow furrowed. Why was she so attentive to this man? He glanced around, noticing other flight attendants stealing quick looks at Mr. Greer as they moved through the cabin. The tension in Peter's chest tightened, but his ego demanded he maintain control of the situation. "Well," Peter said, forcing a grin, "I guess you're a regular then." The sarcasm was thinly veiled. Mr. Greer didn't take the bait. "You could say that," he replied, his voice measured. The flight attendant's next words shattered Peter's carefully constructed facade. "Mr. Greer, if there's anything you need during the flight, just let me or any of the crew know. We're happy to accommodate." Her smile lingered before she walked away, leaving Peter stunned. His curiosity turned to unease. Who exactly was this man? But Peter wasn't ready to back down, not yet. His pride wouldn't allow it, even as cracks began forming in his assumptions. The passengers' curiosity morphed into quiet satisfaction, their earlier discomfort replaced by a shared sense of justice. The man who had been so sure of himself, so quick to judge, was now visibly shrinking in his seat. Peter could feel their stares, tiny needles pricking his already wounded pride. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, though it was unclear if he was addressing the flight attendant, Mr. Greer, or simply himself. Mr. Greer finally looked up, his calm gaze meeting Peter's. "Not quite the raffle winner you had me pegged for, huh?" His tone wasn't angry, but there was a sharpness to it, a subtle reminder of their earlier exchange. Peter flushed, humiliation creeping up his neck like wildfire. "I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered, though even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow and weak. "Didn't you?" Mr. Greer asked, his voice low and measured. Then, without another word, he returned to his book, leaving Peter to wrestle with the weight of his own assumptions. But the worst was far from over. Peter was about to learn that actions have consequences, and lessons often come with an audience. The cabin seemed quieter now, though Peter suspected it was only his embarrassment amplifying every sound around him. Passengers nearby tried not to stare, but their furtive glances told him they were savoring this moment of poetic justice. Peter's chest tightened as he stared at his tablet, pretending to focus on emails that suddenly felt trivial. Meanwhile, Mr. Greer radiated an effortless calm, resuming his reading as though nothing had happened. Occasionally, he underlined a passage or jotted down a thought, each action infuriating Peter further, not because Mr. Greer had done anything wrong, but precisely because he hadn't. Every judgment Peter had made, every snide remark, now felt like a spotlight shining on his own insecurities. The flight attendants continued their service, but Peter noticed how they lingered just a little longer near Mr. Greer, offering refills and additional snacks with genuine warmth. One even brought him a handwritten note, which he accepted with a gracious nod. Peter couldn't help but notice the stark difference in their demeanor compared to how they interacted with him, polite but perfunctory. It wasn't just the crew. Even the passengers' body language had shifted. A woman across the aisle, who had seemed visibly uncomfortable during Peter's earlier remarks, now offered Mr. Greer a warm smile when their eyes met. A man a few rows back leaned forward, whispering something to his seatmate while gesturing subtly toward Mr. Greer. Peter's chest burned as he realized he'd gone from being unnoticed to being silently judged, and undeniably so. Finally, unable to sit in silence any longer, Peter turned to Mr. Greer. "Look," he began, his voice low, "I think we got off on the wrong foot." Mr. Greer closed his book and set it on his lap. He looked at Peter, his expression unreadable but not unkind. "Do we need to talk about this?" he asked, his tone measured. Peter hesitated. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say, or rather, he wasn't sure how to say it without sounding like he was trying to save face. I didn't realize who you were," he admitted finally, his voice faltering. "And if you had?" Mr. Greer asked, raising an eyebrow. Peter opened his mouth, then closed it again. The truth was too uncomfortable to say aloud. If he'd known who Mr. Greer was, he would have treated him differently. The realization sat heavy in his gut, an unwelcome reminder of the biases he'd carried onto this flight. "I guess I made some assumptions," Peter said after a long pause. Mr. Greer leaned back, studying Peter for a moment before speaking. "Assumptions are easy," he said. "They let you stay comfortable with the story you've already decided to tell yourself. but they're not the truth. Peter nodded slowly, though the words stung. It wasn't an angry rebuke, it was worse. It was a quiet truth that left no room for argument. The rest of the flight passed in relative silence. Peter occasionally glanced at Mr. Greer, who had returned to his book, but he didn't dare interrupt again. Instead, he found himself reflecting on the subtle lesson he'd just been handed. It wasn't just about Mr. Greer, it was about the way Peter viewed the world, the assumptions he made without realizing, and the quiet harm those assumptions could cause. When the plane began its descent into Los Angeles, Peter felt an odd mix of relief and regret. Relief that the flight was ending, and regret that he hadn't handled himself better. As the passengers disembarked, Peter lingered, letting others file out first. He watched as Mr. Greer exited the plane, greeted warmly by an airline representative waiting at the gate. Peter sighed, pulling his bag from the overhead bin. He wasn't proud of how he'd acted, but maybe, just maybe, he could use this as a turning point. After all, sometimes the most important lessons aren't the ones you expect. They're the ones that force you to confront yourself. As Peter stepped into the bustling terminal at LAX, he felt different. The world around him carried on as usual. Passengers hurried to their connections, announcements echoed over the intercom, and airport staff bustled through the crowds. But Peter's thoughts lingered on the quiet man from the flight. A Greer had taught him something, not through anger or lectures, but through the way he carried himself, refusing to stoop to Peter's level of judgment. It was a lesson Peter wouldn't soon forget. Your assumptions say more about you than the people you judge. Peter found himself questioning not only how he behaved but also why he'd been so quick to form those opinions in the first place. Maybe it was time to challenge those ingrained habits, to approach people with curiosity instead of judgment. He had a long way to go, but the first step was recognizing there was work to be done. As he made his way to the baggage claim, he glanced back toward the gate, half expecting to see Mr. Greer. But of course, he was already gone, leaving behind only the lingering impact of his presence. And to you, dear reader, here's the real takeaway: it's easy to judge someone based on surface-level impressions. But every person you meet has a story, a depth you might not see at first glance. Assumptions are shortcuts, lazy ways to understand the world. Instead, take the time to ask questions, to look deeper, and to treat everyone with the respect they deserve. You might just be surprised by what you learn, not about them, but about yourself. What lessons have you learned from the unexpected moments in your life? Let us know in the comments below.